All right. You know, what is morality? Is it wrong for me to shove my best friend? Better yet, is it wrong to put pineapple on pizza? Let's dive in. All right, hello and welcome to the show. This is Adam Answers Anything. It is November 13th, Thursday, November 13th. If you happen to be watching yesterday, first of all, congratulations. You're somehow stumbled upon my channel and stumbled upon my live stream. But you would have noticed yesterday that the channel, or that the video wasn't really working. Like the video would come in, it would come out, wasn't really working. There was something wrong. And I didn't realize it until after the stream was over that the connection between OBS and YouTube, I think, or somewhere in the connections of the live stream, it just kept coming in and coming out the entire time. And so when I saw that a 39-minute live stream was actually 15 minutes on YouTube, I thought, oh boy. And so I watched the video and quickly realized, like half of this entire thing is missing because it just cuts out, which is very unfortunate. So I decided, well, I'm just going to redo the live stream. You know, practice makes perfect. So I had an hour to practice this episode yesterday, which is great. So I just had practice, which means it's going to be even better this time, since I already had all the practice that I had first time. So if you're watching this and wondering why I'm doing a second episode a day after a previous one, well, that's why, because the episode yesterday didn't really turn out and it didn't work. So here we are. And as with yesterday, our conversation, or I should say our topic for today is on morality. What is morality and where does it come from? Before I start, two quick things. First thing I want to say is, if you notice up over there in the corner, you'll see a QR code. If you would like to ask a question, it could be any question that you want to ask, that you thought, this random guy on YouTube, I'm just going to ask a question and throw a softball at him or throw a hardball. Who cares? Just, any question. Feel free to scan that QR code and you could submit any question that you would like to be answered on Adam Answers Anything. Also, there's an option for you to be a part of the show. So let's say there's something that's been bugging you. Maybe it's a question about philosophy, or a question about theology, or a question about culture. Maybe it's just a question of, why do Pixar movies make grown men cry? That's a great question. Let's answer it together. And there's an opportunity there for you to actually suggest whether or not you actually would love to come on the show, because I would love to have you on the show. I would love to have everybody on the show to answer questions together and to wrestle through things like that. They can be difficult questions, or they could be easy questions, or they could just be fun questions. I would love to hang out with you. So go ahead and scan that QR code. I would love to hear from you. Also, if you have a perspective on any of the questions in any episode that I go through, please feel free to leave a comment down below, letting me know what your perspective is. Let me know what your thoughts are, and maybe you disagree with what I have to say. I'm sure there's a lot of room for diversity apart from what I say, of course. And I'm sure I'm wrong about a lot of things. So I'd love to hear what your perspective is. And maybe your perspective actually helps me to think about these questions differently. Go ahead and leave a comment down below, or maybe just leave something in the chat if you happen to be watching this live, which, if I'm honest, doesn't happen very often. It's usually me just kind of talking to myself. Like I have like two monitors, and I have like myself, my feed right here on this monitor. So in reality, I'm kind of just talking to myself. I don't know if that makes me weird or like just I don't know, but it just helps me because it feels like I'm talking to somebody, even though I'm not talking to anybody. It's just myself. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and dive in for a second time on morality tonight. One of the things I will say about morality is it's an extremely broad topic. There's so much just diversity, and there's such a plethora of conversations and ideas and thoughts and discussions that you could be had around the idea of morality. And we're going to try and just be as comprehensive as we can be, but also not as comprehensive as we could be, because this is kind of a time-limited show. I usually try to keep it under an hour, and I also try to just, at the very least, try to dive into a topic so that we understand the nuances of it, but try not to get caught in the weeds because, there are academic papers and people that are much more well-disciplined and studied than I am who have written on these subjects. And so the question of morality is a very, very broad topic, and so we're going to go into it the best that we can. And it's still going to be somewhat of a surface-level examination, but it's hopefully going to be just enough examination so that if you had any questions, maybe this stokes the questions or maybe answers them or encourages you to dive deeper. First thing I'm going to say is, what's the difference between morality and ethics? You may hear the word ethics thrown around a lot. Morality, I think that you could say, is the personal or societal beliefs about what is wrong. So morality is what I believe to be right or wrong, good or bad. There are cultural norms or values, rules that people actually hold, whether they come from culture, religion, conscience, tradition, right? We'll look into those different perspectives. But these are the things that I believe to be right and wrong, right? I believe that it's wrong for someone to just cut you off when they're turning onto a street and then drive like 10 below the speed limit, even though they just cut you off and should be driving like 5 above the speed limit so they can match your speed. Obviously, that's never happened to me. I don't know what you're talking about. But I believe that's morally wrong. I just believe people shouldn't do that. That's what morality is. It's what you actually believe. Ethics is the practical application of it or study of it. So ethics would be the systematic philosophical study of morality. It's the thinking about morality, analyzing, questioning, and justifying moral claims. That's why in the judicial branch of government, judges, and these judges use ethics to determine what is right and what is wrong, and they use the Constitution and the laws as the source of that ethic. And so, just think of morality as morality as the paint, the colors of paint, and ethics as the act of painting, the application. What we're going to do is we're going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-ish. Then there's a 6th one. So we're going to go over 6 systems of morality. So these are 6 sort of broad views of morality, 6 ways of thinking about morality. I guess you could call them systems or schools of thought. These are kind of broad categories. And within each of these, they can be broken down into more nuanced perspectives and more nuanced positions and more nuanced philosophies. But and these aren't the only, there's not just 6, right? There's more than this. There could certainly be considered more than this. But these are just 6, the 6 that I believe are probably the most well-known, the most studied. And so we're going to go over those, and I'm going to provide examples for each of them, and then I'm going to share what I think is the best answer to the questions that morality raises. So we're going to provide some thought experiments and try and find a sufficient explanation or sufficient solution to a thought experiment. And I'll kind of share what my thoughts are on what the most sufficient solution to the thought experiment is. Okay, let's dive in. So, school of thought, I'll use the phrase school of thought. Number 1 is deontological ethics. It's kind of a big word. What's deontological ethics? Well, a good way to think about it is it's just duty-based morality. The core idea here is that moral rules or duties determine what's right and wrong. regardless of what the consequences are. The best figure that you could probably associate with deontological ethics is Immanuel Kant. So if you ever see the word deontological, just think Immanuel Kant. Another way that you could describe this is his categorical imperative. In other words, what Kant meant is he meant that something should be true and only true if something should be true if and only if that thing can be applied to all people, all places, everywhere, universally. Lying is wrong, even if it saves someone's life, because truth-telling is a moral duty that can be applied to every person, everywhere, at all times. The intention behind an action and inherent adherence to a moral law is what the focus of deontological ethics is. Here's an example. Telling the truth even when it causes harm. Suppose that a friend asks you a direct question. Does this financial plan have serious risks that I should know about? You know that the truth is, yes, this financial plan has serious risks that you should know about. And telling them might upset them, make them anxious, potentially harm your working relationship with them. A consequentialist, which we're going to talk about later, consequentialist might consider withholding the truth if they believe that the harm of telling it to the person outweighs the benefits of not telling it. But a deontologist, however, says you have a duty to tell the truth because honesty is a moral rule. It's a categorical imperative that must be followed regardless of the consequences. So you answer honestly, even though the outcome may be unpleasant. The moral action is right because it follows an imperative, not because it leads to the best consequences, but because it is something that can be and should be applied to all people. So therefore, it is categorically imperative that we apply those truths as morally righteous actions. So that's number one, deontological ethics. Number two is consequentialism. Consequentialism. Another way to think about it, instead of saying the confusing word consequentialism, is just outcome-based morality. In other words, the outcome is what will determine the morality of something. It's determined by its outcome. The most famous, or I guess the most well-known type of consequentialist thought is utilitarianism. This is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism would say that actions are right if they produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, what does that mean exactly, right? We kind of get our heads around that. It's like, I understand it, but what exactly does it mean? Well, here's an example. And this is a very famous thought experiment. So you've probably heard this before. The trolley problem. You see a runaway trolley heading down a track toward 5 workers who will be killed unless something changes. You are standing next to a lever that can divert the trolley onto another track where 1 worker is standing. You see, a consequentialist asks which action leads to the best overall outcome, least harm, most well-being. The consequentialist conclusion is typically that, well, you would pull the lever. Why? Because sacrificing 1 life in order to save 5. Saving more lives creates the better consequence overall, even though neither of them is really a positive consequence. One is better than the other. The moral rightness of an action becomes entirely focused on its outcome rather than any categorical imperative rule or duty that we're obligated to follow regardless of the outcome. So that's consequentialist. That's universalism. Number 3 would be virtue ethics. Another way to think of virtue ethics is character-based morality. Whenever you see the word virtue in philosophy, tie the word character to it. Character and virtue. What does this mean? What does character-based morality mean? It's morality that's about cultivating a virtuous character rather than following rules or calculations and based on certain outcomes. A key figure in this would be the Greek thinker Aristotle. He believed that there are certain virtues, such as courage, temperance, justice, prudence, patience, and these virtues are what determine what we should and shouldn't do. Is something courageous? Well, then you should do that thing. If it's not courageous, then don't do that thing. The Nicomachean Ethic is perhaps one of the most famous Greek writings on, well, ethics, applied morality, and flourishing, well-being, or happiness, according to Aristotle, is the ultimate end of mankind. It's what we ultimately should be achieving for, should be striving for, is happiness. And being virtuous is what leads us there. So if something is patient or if something is prudent, then morally you should choose that thing because it's what leads us to ultimately happiness. An example of this might be acting with courage in a difficult situation. Imagine you have a coworker, or you witness a coworker being unfairly blamed by a supervisor for a mistake that they didn't make. You know that speaking up might put you at risk. It could cause tension with the supervisor, and staying silent would be easier. A consequentialist would weigh the outcomes. A deontologist would look for a rule, a categorical imperative. A virtue ethicist would ask, however, what would a courageous and just person do? What actions express good character? So you step forward and you say, well, actually I saw what happened and it wasn't her fault at all. The act is moral, not primarily because of its consequences or because it follows a rule, but because it embodies the virtues: justice, courage, honesty, integrity. You're cultivating and expressing good character traits, which, according to Aristotle, lead to happiness and lead to a well-lived life. So that's number 3. Number 4 is moral relativism. The idea behind moral relativism is that morality is relative to all sorts of things. It's relative to your culture, it's relative to your historical background, and it's relative to your socioeconomic upbringing. It's relative to your personal context, your family. The implication is that there's no universal moral truth specifically, but what's right in one's culture, one's context, might be wrong for someone else in their context. It can make moral reform or criticisms on injustice somewhat difficult, but what is an example of moral relativism? Well, here's an example. Let's say you have different cultures having different norms about different forms of truth. In many Western cultures, honesty and directness are seen as moral virtues. If someone asks, "Do you like my cooking?" you're expected to answer truthfully. Lying, even to spare feelings, is often seen as morally wrong. But in some East Asian or Middle Eastern cultures, preserving harmony and avoiding embarrassment are higher moral priorities than blunt honesty. A polite, indirect response, even if not strictly true, is considered the moral action because it protects the relationship. Difference between cultures. In one culture, it's considered morally right and acceptable and normal to say the truth, even if it's not what you want to say, that the cooking is actually really bad. But in another culture, it's actually more morally acceptable to say, well, the cooking was good, even if it wasn't really good, but it's morally right to preserve the harmony in relationships to prevent embarrassment. A moral relativist explain this by saying whether lying is right or wrong depends on the cultural norms and values of the society in question. There is no single universal moral rule that applies in all contexts. That's number 4. Number 5 would be evolution and naturalistic ethics. Evolution, I want to add a caveat, neo-Darwinian evolutionary and naturalistic ethics. Evolution is an extremely broad term. Not every evolutionist believes in evolutionary ethics. So I just want to make that caveat. What's the core idea? Well, the core idea here is that morality has evolved over a certain number of years as a social adaptation, promoting cooperation and survival. There's different variations among here. There's psychological, there's natural law theory, of course. But the whole idea is that our behaviors, what we consider to be morally right and morally wrong, has evolved over millennia of trial and error, and those things, those ideas, which eventually prove beneficial to a species, become moral obligations. For example, why humans help strangers. Imagine a person sees someone falling on the sidewalk and rushes over to help, even though the stranger offers no benefit, and helping takes time and it takes effort, and the person gains nothing really concrete. It's just an altruistic moment of helping someone on the sidewalk. See, a naturalistic or evolutionary ethicist says that this behavior arises from traits that developed because they helped human groups survive. Over time, this kind of characteristic was very beneficial, and different clans or different communities, they thrived when they exhibited these altruistic characteristics. So therefore, helping others increases group survival. Groups that cooperated tend to share resources, protect each other, raise children collaboratively, and outcompete less cooperative groups. So these groups survived, and they grew, and they flourished. So that's number 5. That's evolutionary and ethicists. Number 6 is the divine command theory. The core idea here obviously being that moral rightness depends on God's will, or God's commands. What God says is right and what God says is wrong. An act is right because God commands it. Now, again, this is very broad, very abstract, so this applies not just to Christianity, this applies to Islam, this applies to Hinduism, this applies to all faiths that have a theistic core at its foundation, a theistic core. So here's my thought experiment. I want you to imagine for a minute that you walk into a big stadium, and when you walk into the stadium, you see there's this big green field of grass in the middle of the stadium, and there's a whole bunch of people standing around on this field. You sit down, and a voice comes over the loudspeaker that says, "Okay, let's play football." Okay. Well, everyone's left standing there. And the reason why is because no one has heard of football. They don't know what it is, why it is, how it's played. They know nothing about it. Let's imagine that the word isn't football, but let's say someone comes on the loudspeaker and says, "Let's play schlartball." Well, what's that? I don't know what that is. I'm assuming it's a sport because we're in a sports stadium, but how do we do that? How do we know what it is and how to do the thing? Well, if I'm, an evolutionary or naturalistic ethicist, and that's my moral framework, then we might let's just do trial and error. Look over there, there's this ball that's shaped like a wedge. Let's go pick that up, and okay, well, maybe we can throw it. We'll just maybe we have to see how far we throw it. Okay. Can you figure out how to play football by trial and error? By what's successful and what's not successful? Well, no. You can get far for sure, in the sense that throwing the ball is certainly a part of the process. But if something is successful, does it make it a part of football? Well, no. It's not. Something's not a part of football because it was successful in, this is a thing that you can do with the ball, is pick it up and throw it. It's okay, we can pick up and throw the ball. That's a successful thing. The people in the crowd likes it when we do that. So therefore, that's football. Well, no. It's a part of it, but it's not. And you also aren't aware that it's a part of football. What about consequentialists? Let's say if we think, okay, well, what's going to bring the most people here the greatest joy? Okay, well, let's say if we divide up into teams, and we're going to take the ball and we're going to throw it, and we throw it at each other. and we'll see, you know, who can catch the ball. Okay, well, you've given joy to the people in the crowds because they're watching action happen on the grass on the field, and you've given joy to the people that are standing on the field because everyone gets a chance to catch the ball and everyone takes turns throwing it. So you've brought the greatest happiness to the greatest amount of people, but you still have no idea what football is. you have no idea what football is. You have some sense, like you're starting to maybe think that teams and throwing the football or throwing the ball, maybe that's a part of it. You're getting a sense for it. But there's no reason why you should think that any of this is a part of what football is. And so here's what I'm trying to say. And I won't go through every single one of them here, but here's what I'm trying to say. Unless you have a book, and the title of the book says, The Official Rules and Guide of How to Play Football. Unless you have that, then you will never know for sure whether or not you're playing football. And you'll never know how to play football. Exactly. What do I mean by that? What I mean by is, let's take Immanuel Kant, deontological ethics. If stealing is something that can be and should be applied to all people because it is a categorical imperative, so if it's something that can be applied to all people, then therefore it should be a moral duty not to steal, because stealing is wrong, because stealing like is a categorical imperative that can be applied to all people, and so therefore we shouldn't do it. But there's nothing telling me why. Also, like, what's the criteria for saying whether or not something could be applied to all people? I mean, because if you've ever spoken to someone who's like a very analytical thinker, they can find a million different ways to examine one single thing, one single idea. And so if I can't directly think of a way in which some moral rule could apply to all people at all times, I could probably think of how to make it look like it could. I mean, what's the criteria for determining it? I mean, just saying that reason alone is going to be enough to determine what's categorically imperative, what's right and wrong, what's a universal truth. Well, I mean, there's millions of different flavors of reason. What's reasonable to one person isn't necessarily what's reasonable to another. That's kind of a problem. What happens when my reason tells me that it's categorically true that everyone should give me $100 every time they see me? That's categorically true. I mean, I think you can apply that rule to every single person. Every single person would nod their head and say, yeah, I think that I should get $100 every time someone sees me. Okay, well, it applies to everybody. So why doesn't everyone do it? I think we get in the weeds in too much of a subjective realm when we try to define what exactly do we mean by reason is what solves, or reason is what defines categorical imperatives. How do we determine, what metric do we use to determine what's universal and what isn't universal? And it's obvious that people aren't going to agree on what is and isn't universal. What about consequentialism? Well, that's a difficult one. Is the overall happiness of most people the thing that's always, morally right or morally wrong? I think the trolley problem is one of the most, I want to say, discussed or debated ethical thought experiments that you'll see with utilitarianism. But I think that it requires people to always act in a way that produces overall happiness. I mean, it sounds like a nice theory, but in practice, it can make extraordinary demands or expectations of people. I mean, if you increase net happiness by donating most of your income to save lives, utilitarianism suggests that you have to do it. I mean, if I was just to say, I'm just going to give all my income to these things that are going to increase the livelihoods of like 200 people, even though I have a wife and a child, I have to do that because 200 people is more significant than my wife and my child, so I should give away everything that we have and not have a house. If taking a break or relaxing or buying something for yourself isn't the most happiness maximizing option, it treats it as morally wrong. Like it's morally wrong for me to take a break from work and get up and go walk around and have a coffee or something to look outside. If there's something better that I can be doing that would increase happiness for a different number of people or maybe for myself, then it's morally wrong that I do that thing. Everyday activities seem to become moral failings because I could have done something better or I could have done something different. I think that's one of the problems with consequentialism. It's one of the difficulties with consequentialism. If that's my only metric for determining what is morally right or morally wrong, well, then I think that there's ways to argue that we all should be sacrificing and we should all be sacrificing our incomes, or we should all be sacrificing the clothes off our back, which, don't get me wrong, I think that there's a lot of morality in those principles. But I think that there are a lot of exceptions to consequentialism. And I'll also say this. There's still nothing telling me that I shouldn't. Right? Just saying, well, you should do this thing because it makes the most people happy. True. It might make the most people happy, but there's still no reason why I shouldn't instead make myself happy. Like, if it's between like donating $10,000 to like 10,000 people, which everyone can get $1, it doesn't make sense. $10,000 to like 100 people or something. Or I just like keep the money. Well, like, why shouldn't I keep the money? Well, that's morally wrong. Yeah, but says who? I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't be morally wrong. Because what if my happiness will lead to the happiness of a significant more number of people like 5 years down the road because I end up using that money in a certain way, which eventually leads to the happiness of significantly more amount of people. I can't know the interconnectedness of the consequences of my actions that could lead to a moral or more unmoral decision. What about moral relativism? I think moral relativism is, I think that's one it gets kind of battered down a lot. I mean, honestly, kind of for a good reason, because it's like, if something's true for me, then why am I going to be held morally culpable? Why should I be held lawfully culpable and like I'm responsible for laws if I believe that they're not morally relevant? I mean, if you go to one historical or cultural context, and that culture, say you're like an ancient Mayan culture, does human sacrifices or child sacrifices or something like that, and you're saying to yourself, okay, well, that's acceptable in their culture, you would have to agree that it's morally right for them to do so. And it wouldn't be morally right for someone living in the United States to do human sacrifice, obviously. Well, because that's not our cultural context. But says who? Like, what basis do you have for saying that? I would not agree whatsoever that murder is okay. And human sacrifice, just because it's a cultural acceptable thing, is not okay. Here's a question. Was it culturally acceptable at the time to be anti-Semitic in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s? Was it culturally acceptable what they did? Because Nazism, Nazi Germany was a culture. It was a historical context. Was it wrong? And if you're a moral relativist, I would argue that you can't say that it was. Because once you've said there's no moral truths, there's no universal moral truths, well then you've done away with any reason why anyone should accept yours. And also, by the way, saying that there's no universal moral truths is a universal moral truth. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a position of how can we get the people on the field to play football? That's what I want to do. The problem is that they have no reason to play football. They have no idea what football is unless they have the book that says the rules and regulations of the game of football. And that book tells them how to play it. That's why I subscribe to the divine command theory, in case it wasn't obvious. Because I believe that it's only a moral lawgiver who tells us, here is what's right and here is what's morally wrong. Only under those circumstances can we truly know what morality is. And can we truly know what right living is? Psalm 119:9, how can a young man keep his ways pure? By guarding it according to your word. The moral law book. Psalm 119:105, your word is a lamp to my feet, a light to my path. God's word shows us the way to right and moral living. Now, some people want to ask, this is called the Euthyphro dilemma, is something morally good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's morally good? My answer would be neither, but if I had to pick one, I'd say it's good because God commands it. But why would I say neither? I'd say neither because goodness, what is good, what is right, what is just, is found within the nature of who God is. So I want you to think about it this way. Imagine you have 5 different colors of clay. Say you have purple, you have green, you have orange, you have yellow, and you have blue. You take all those colors of clay and you form out of them just like this statue of a guy, of a dude. Okay. Now let's say this just we're representing this statue as like, this is kind of like a representation of God, of who God is. Well, morality, what is good, what is ethically right, what is good, what is just, they're found in who God is. So, in other words, let's say I'm living in a world where like I'm living in this clay world, and it is accepted that blue is a good color, green is a good color, yellow is a good color, purple, orange. Well, they're good colors because they're a part of who God is. And God has made this universe. He spoke being into existence from nothing at the beginning of creation. And the moment he spoke every single thing in the universe into being, they were his words, they were his breath. And with that breath, he brought life into the universe. And when he created man out of the dust of the ground, he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So it is who God is that defines his creation, because he is the one who has made it. So it's not that morally right things just exist apart from God, and he looks at it and says, oh, that's a good thing, or that's a good thing. And it's not that there's moral concepts out there just existing in the ether, and he's like, I'm going to pick that one to be good, or I'm going to pick that one to be good. That's not. It's neither of those things. When in reality, it's who God is. That to be someone who loves justice, to be someone who seeks to love your neighbor as yourself, who denies themselves, takes up their cross and follows Jesus. Someone who is like that is emulating the very nature of who God is. Be holy as I am holy. Jesus says that Paul says, "Let this mind be in you, which is in Christ Jesus." See, the thing is morality given to us through God's word isn't about like, here's some things that I have to do because I have to do them. They're just like laws and rules that just like are damper on my game, and it's just I don't want to do these things because this is or these are racist or these are ignorant or whatever. The truth is that God made us. As a result, like the way in which we will most flourish in our lives is by pursuing a relationship with who God is. And the way we do that, part of the way we do that is, number one, trust in Jesus. Number two, by living a moral life. I mean, living a life that reflects the nature of who he is. That's what I would argue. And if you don't know Jesus, I hope you will. And I hope you reach out, send me a message in that QR code, send me a message in that comment section, in that chat. And I would love to tell you about who Jesus is. Because let me tell you something. I have this like tattoo on my arm. It says the eternal silence of these infinite spaces fills me with dread. That's a quote from Pascal, from Blaise Pascal. And one of the reasons that quote is on my arm is because when I was, I guess, agnostic or atheist at this time in my life, when I was in college, I remember looking out of a window late at night. It was 2 a.m, and I thought to myself, everything in me is screaming that there's something bigger than myself, something that made me, something that knows me, something that made this universe, something that explains everything. Something in me is screaming it. But I'm believing that there isn't. Like, I'm being told that there isn't. I'm being told that it's just that existence precedes essence, according to Sartre, and I just exist, and I have just to figure out what my own meaning is and figure out what I'm supposed to do with my life. And I just sat there and I felt so forlorn because I'm like, I don't get it. I look at the universe and it screams to me that there's a creator. It screams to me that there's something so infinitely bigger than I am. But if there really isn't, right? If all this nihilism is true, if there really isn't, that is the most terrifying thing. Because it screams to me as though there is. And I didn't know Pascal. I had never read him at the time. But when I read that quote, I thought, wow, this guy who lived in like the 1600s somehow knows me. He somehow knows me really well, because that hit the nail on the head and it hit deep into my heart, and I wept reading that, realizing that I'm not alone. And I'm telling you, there is something bigger than ourselves. And it's not just a thing that's out there in the ether. It's someone who wants to know you, who wants to love you, if only you'll trust in him. So my choice would be number 6, the divine command theory. If there's anything that you would take away from this discussion about morality, I hope that it would be this. I hope that it would be that there is such a breadth, like so much perspective on what morality is. And I'll say this: never throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right? Just because I am very like a strong, like passionate Christian who believes in the Word of God, it doesn't mean that I'm going to throw deontological ethics out the door. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm just going to get rid of utilitarianism. I think it's really, really important to study these systems, to study these thoughts on morality, because as a professor of mine in college used to say, all truth is God's truth. And there is truth in these moral systems. And it's a beautiful thing when you get to discover that truth and say, oh, that looks a little bit about like who God is. Like when I studied Stoicism a couple weeks ago and I did the video on it, there was a lot about Stoicism that's reflective of the Word of God. And that's such a beautiful thing to find that. If I meet someone who's, a moral relativist or a virtue ethicist or someone who believes in just naturalistic evolution, ethics, I'm not gonna say, oh, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're not smart. Or, of course, I'm not gonna say that. If I meet someone who's a moral relativist, I'll say, hey, I'd love to grab lunch, love to grab a drink, and to grab some coffee and just talk. I'd love to hear more about moral relativism and what led you to that, and what are some convincing arguments for it, and if you're open to it, I'd love to share my position on the divine command theory and what led me to that. I want to have a relationship with these people who have these different moral beliefs than I do, because we live in such a complex, beautiful world, and people have so many different beliefs. And yes, of course, I want someone to eventually, recognize the Word of God and say, wow, I believe in this. Of course I do. I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't think that. Of course I do. But I want them to know that I love them, that they are loved beyond measure, and that they matter. What they believe and feel and think matters. So that's today's episode. That's tonight's episode. Again, I am so sorry if you tried to watch yesterday's version of this episode and it didn't work out. I'm still trying to learn OBS. So far, so this entire time I've been watching the little bar down below, and it has not given me the X mark, so I don't think that it's skipped anything this entire episode, which is really good, really good. So sorry again about the last episode. I'm thankful that I was able to have time to get in this time so that I could get this episode done and out there. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please hit a like, hit the like button down there. And if you're not, please hit subscribe. That really definitely helps the show. It helps the show get out to more people, and for YouTube's algorithm to hopefully one day figure out what it's doing. Yeah, so if you really like today's episode, please hit the like button, leave a comment, hit subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And thank you for joining me tonight. And I just want you to know that I love all of you so very much, and I hope that you have an incredible night. I hope you have an incredible weekend as well. And if you're in the Midwest, buckle up, or I should say button up. Stay warm, because it's a pretty cold November. So, all right, have a good one.